So now we're starting to get a feel of the O3 model. One of the beautiful things about the O3 model is that you can actually display the project to anyone who wants to know about the project in this simple little diagram. Here's the outcome we're trying to achieve. Here's the outputs this project's going to deliver to the organisation, and here's my objectives. Elegant and simple. But there's lots of little nuances now that we can bring to bear. The first is this key link between outputs and outcome. They have to be provable. That is, you have to be able to prove that, in our example, putting in a new product set will lead to the retention of customers as our outcome. Can we prove that? And of course the answer is your business partners and stakeholders will work on that. So it's got to be provable. It's got to be direct. That's the second concept. Direct. Does that output directly lead to the retention of customers as our outcome? So we've got provable and we've got direct. The final lens to look at here in the connection between outputs and outcomes is it sufficient? In other words, to achieve the outcome, are all the outputs being produced that are sufficient to actually achieve that outcome? We've seen examples where we've looked at a project, identified an outcome the sponsor wants, there's already an existing project in place, and when you retrofit the O3 model, which we'll talk about in the next tutorial, which is very powerful, there are a whole bunch of outputs that were going to be required in addition to the outputs already determined for the project to achieve that outcome. In other words, even if the project had produced all its outputs, they weren't sufficient enough to achieve the outcome. This gives you hints to related projects and the idea of programs, which we'll pick up in the next and final tutorial in this series. As you start becoming even more familiar with the O3, you'll come across the situation which I alluded to in the previous tutorial, which is if we do all these outputs in our little example, and I deliver those new website and the new product set, and the primary outcome we're going for is to retain customers, you may pick up a bonus. That new set of products, that new website may attract new customers as well. And it's very common for projects to have more than one outcome. What I have learnt to do is to simply keep the sponsor focused on which of those two, attracting new ones or keeping existing ones, is the most important. So you can have a primary outcome and a set of secondary outcomes. What you'll generally find is all the outputs will lead to the primary outcome, but not all the outputs will lead to the secondaries. Think of them as bonuses. You should be able to list them in your business case, but after you've got the idea of the primary outcome from the sponsor and he or she starts listing secondaries, keep them focused by saying, which of these could I take away and still be successful? And that'll lead you to getting the sponsor back to what is that primary outcome. One of the most common and frustrating mistakes that I see in business cases, and I have seen for decades, is the extension of the O3 model beyond the outcome. They use terms such as a value chain, and whenever you hear that term, you're going to find something like this. If A, then B. If B, then C. If C, then D. If D, then E. And they're just moving and stretching the links between the project and some wondrous end result. The term I'm going to call these things is an impact. So remember, we've got our objective, our output, and our outcome. If you get the outcome, that can and may lead to something even bigger, but it is not sufficient. For example, in our case study, if we achieve the outcome of retaining customers, that may be part of enabling the organisation to get back to number one. But clearly you can see two things. One, retaining customers is not sufficient enough to get to that number one position. And the second thing you'll see is there's a whole bunch of other projects that would have to happen in sequence to actually achieve that. So as a general rule, stop at the outcome. It's reasonable to say if we get the outcome, this is some potential. But the further you move the value chain out, the more stakeholders are involved, the harder it is to track the relationships and measure whether they've worked, and the more people are going to be involved, and assumption after assumption after assumption piles up. This then leads to the third really interesting implication of the O3 model, which is roles and responsibilities. It is the project manager's job. We are hired to deliver outputs. When those outputs are delivered and a PIR is done, our job's done. We go home. But of course, as we talked about in the whole of life model in the previous tutorials, the project's not over. Someone's got to take those outputs and actually move them to achieve and use them to achieve the outcome. And we'll pick this up again in the benefits tutorials. That is the job of a sponsor and stakeholders, who you might want to call benefit owners, but it's also the support people. So you've got this sort of complex relationship. We build it and deliver it, but the sponsor owns the whole of life till achieve the outcome is done. This is why going to impact is so important, to not do that. You can hold a sponsor legitimately accountable for taking the new products, the new website, the new contact center, and making sure that leads to the retention of customers. It is very difficult for a sponsor then, a single sponsor, to then say, once I've done that, I'm now going to get us back to number one. It just clarifies roles. We talked about this in the whole of life model, but just to finish off, while it is our job to produce outputs, it is fundamentally our job. It is our duty of care as good project managers to make sure that everyone in the team, all the critical stakeholders, understand what the sponsor's outcome is. And as a project manager, and we're building the outputs, we need to be conscious of, are there things we need to also produce that will help the sponsor convert those outputs to the outcome? It's a duty of care we have. We look after customers by making sure that everything they need, including the outputs we produce, are in place for them to pick them up and use them to get to their outcome.